Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of Theology in the Raw. All right, I've got Mike Cosper on the show today. Mike is the creator and host of the uber popular Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast series. It's going to be a 12-part series. I think he's in episode, I want to say 8 right now. And it's stirred up a lot of discussions, some controversy as well. And so we talk a lot about that, kind of why he created it, what he hopes to get out of it. What he wants the church to learn from the series, and then he responds to a whole bunch of criticism that he's gotten through the creation of the podcast. So this is super raw, super honest conversation. You're really gonna enjoy it. All right, I'm here with Mike Cosper, the man of the Christian hour. I'm almost done with the most recent episode. I've listened to most. I've listened to them all, but there's been glitches where I usually listen to podcasts at night, so sometimes I'll fall asleep. I'll pick it up the next morning. I'm like, I got to go back and finish. But anyway, I've listened to almost all of it, and I've really enjoyed it. And then I started Googling around and saw that a lot of other people really enjoyed it too. But man, yeah, it's definitely kicked the hornet's nest. I guess we could start by like what led you to do this? Was this something that was like years in the making, or do you have? I don't even know if you have like a personal connection with Mars Hill. I know you obviously know a lot of people on the inside, but did you know Mark or
Sure.
Just what led to creating this thing?
Yeah, so I helped plant a church in 2000 in Louisville called Sojourn, and I served on the staff there for about 15 years. And in 2003 or so, like late 03, early 04, we joined Acts 29.
That's right.
So they'd been up and running for quite a few years. Darren Patrick connected with us kind of through the SBC and recruited us to the network and said, hey, great partnerships for church planting, all of that. We knew who Driscoll was. I'd first heard Driscoll at a conference back in 2001, a month after 9/11.
Wow.
This kind of wild event where he, it was like early emergent days, and so it's a month after 9/11, and the coordinators of this conference decided to kind of try and do like a, I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but kind of like a peace, love, and happiness, like let's come together.
Yeah.
With our Muslim neighbors, and and Driscoll was having none of it. So he showed up and screamed at everybody for an hour and went away, and it left an impression.
Was that you talked about that in the podcast, right? You have clips from that. That's right.
Yeah.
When he got in, like some people were pushing back in a session. Right. Oh, right. Okay. So you were there.
That's right. Yeah, I was in the room, and it was kind of a legendary thing. I came to find out, kind of a legendary thing for a lot of the guys at Mars Hill, because it just was sort of like a delineation moment for them with that relationship with a lot of the kind of emergent crew.
Okay.
So we were reformed. Had a lot of sort of commonality. I mean, the missional vision of Acts 29 in those early days was really theologically driven. There was a lot of talk about New Begin, and it was a very different feel than it was maybe 5-6 years later. Okay. And so we were really drawn to that, and were a part of it until 2010. That was around the time of like the Elephant Room and all that stuff started to happen. And so as that's going on, we had a clearer vision for what we wanted to do with church planting, and made our exit. And but over those years, got to know a lot of those folks. Met Mark a few times. He was always really kind to me, kind to my family, and but also heard the stories. Heard the stories from people who worked there about what it was like on the inside.
So how long was it when you started to think about doing this podcast series? Has it been a long time in the making?
Yeah, for sure. I got into podcasting in 2016 as sort of what I felt like was an opportunity to do some storytelling that could serve the church. So did a variety of things for a number of years, but I'd say probably pretty early on, maybe 2017, 2018, I started thinking about this story.
Wow.
Not seriously, but just kind of in the back of my head, like this could be a really interesting story to tell as a podcast. And in part because in spite of the fact that it got a lot of news coverage, it got a lot of blog coverage, you didn't hear a lot from people who were really on the inside, who were leading the organization, trying to lead it through the crisis. The story was often told through like leaked documents, leaked letters, PR statements, which, you know how PR statements are, right? It's like everything's kind of fine tuned and spun. So, man, it was just an awesome opportunity when I came to CT and kind of pitched it to the folks here. Like, I think we could do this. They gave me a lot of time and a long leash to get it done.
Did you think it would be so popular?
No.
I mean, honestly, like, and you could say yes. I mean,
no. I mean, we thought it would do well. I mean, in the Christian podcast space, I think we expected it to do pretty well, because it feels like a space with a lot of opportunity, with a big audience, and not a lot of stuff that's kind of produced at this level. So we thought it would do well there. At one point on the overall iTunes charts, it was like number 3 for a few days.
Oh my gosh.
We did not expect anything. I did not expect anything like that.
So not just Christian, the overall, because I know it's been at like topping out, I think, all the Christian charts, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Overall, it was number 3 for a couple of weeks, and
move over, Joe Rogan. You might get Spotify calling you pretty soon.
That's right. Yeah. So what happened is we just ran into this situation where I think a lot of people heard kind of the way we were telling the story, and these were people who had told us no 3, 6, 9 months before, heard what we were doing with the storytelling and said, okay, I think I'm ready to jump in. Yeah. And just to keep up with the reporting, we had to sort of slow down the release schedule, and because we felt like a lot of these voices are really critical to it.
So in your most recent one, you said that you're getting a lot of people now contacting you saying, hey, I got a story to tell, and so you're slowing it down a bit. I think that's smart. Well, what I mean, I would like to know, maybe more of the backstory, and what does it take to pull this thing off? I mean, it's brilliant. It's beautifully done. It's and the popularity of it, and that maybe that's some of the criticism we can get into. But just aesthetically, it's just I'm eager for the next one too. Not because of failure porn. We'll get into that, but it's just done so well. So what are some of the criticism that you've had to wrestle? What are some of the main things that people have raised criticisms of? Maybe not any criticism, but just
sure.
Yeah, I guess we can say criticism. Let's start there.
Sure. Yeah, no, I don't mind speaking to that. It sort of ends up like at the various ends of the ideological spectrum, right?
Okay.
So I think from sort of more progressive Christianity, I think they'd like to hear more progressive voices, particularly those who were critical of the church for a long, long time. And we've tried to give some space to that, at various moments. And
progressive voices that were part of the church, or
no, that were sort of external critics and offered external analysis over time, right? Like other bloggers and other voices, and on the episode where we talked about kind of women's experience in the church, we tried to sort of make sure we gave some space to that, and particularly talked about Rachel Held Evans, and she was one of the most sort of consistent critics of Driscoll.
Right.
But I think from that end, there were other voices, Matthew Paul Turner and other folks who were doing that for a long time. And then at the other end of the spectrum, I think, that episode in particular, that seems to be the episode that kind of stirred up the most dust. Because we really tried to let the episode kind of let the story be what it was and not theologize too much.
Okay.
Like, here's what women experienced, here were the voices that they heard. And so, I go to a church that's primarily complementarian, and kind of live in that world. And so a lot of my complementarian friends were like, it sounds like you're saying complementarianism's the problem. And I said, no, I mean, that's the context, right? And the community that was around Mark was that way. I think there are questions to be asked, like, is this in the Overton window, and why is it in the Overton window for complementarianism? Why were his books endorsed that way? Why was he welcomed into that community? I think those are hard questions that for some folks we've never gotten good answers for. But yeah, that's been a critique. It's been critiqued as though it were an attack on complementarianism, and And I think it's more about culture than theology in a lot of ways. It's
Yeah.
more about sort of dominance and a leadership culture, even like what how are leaders leading to get what they want out of a community, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. I don't to say it's a critique on I mean, there are healthy versions of complementarianism and more biblical versions where
Hmm.
full equality in value and gifting and well, I guess not to get into the women in leadership thing, but I mean, and then there's very unhealthy versions where it is male dominated. Male,
Right.
there is an oppressive air, there is a belittling, a misogyny that just kind of is there, and to say that all of that's complementarian, I think is unfair.
Hmm.
And yeah, there are a lot of unhealthy versions of
Hmm.
complementarianism out there, but to say that complementarianism breeds an unhealthy whatever, it's like, well, let's go. Anything's going to have its better and worse forms of it. So
Hmm.
yeah, I don't.
Yeah, I mean, and you can look at other scandals in the evangelical world in the last number of years. Whether it's the accusations against Chris Hewerts, who's sort of more in the progressive wing. Bill Hybels was like the champion of
Yeah,
egalitarian leadership in the church for
right.
20 years or more. And he was, by all accounts, I mean, he has credible accusations of being a sexual predator.
Yeah,
So, to sort of lump it into like, well, this is a theological issue, we need to beat that drum harder. I just don't think it's accurate to the broader scope of what was going on
yeah.
when generally that kind of predatory behavior and that kind of authoritarian culture is more about culture than theology. And any theology can be turned into a bludgeon if you want to.
To me, if I could sing in listening to the podcast and knowing some stuff on the inside, it does seem to me as I identified the main problem, which you've addressed several times, is you gotta I almost said Enneagram 8, but like a very, very unhealthy Enneagram 8 who has probably would be diagnosed with clinical narcissism and a ton of power. You wrap all that up into one, throw in the exhaustion of ministry and throw that person on stage. You get critiques against him, and then he's back in the corner, and narcissists respond a certain way. To me, that really is that seems to be the main kind of thing that sunk the ship. Would you agree with that? I mean,
Hmm.
because some of the other, like, even I don't know, like there was a lot of stuff about Mars Hill that looking back, it's like that it wasn't bad in and of itself. The
Hmm.
challenge, you know, guys to be responsible and show up on time, and we're gonna lock the doors if you don't show, the Venture Tree thing. And like some of that's kind of like, well, it's a little bit. Yeah, we should, like I don't know. There's some goodness in a lot of the
Hmm.
stuff they were doing. That's what I appreciate about the podcast. I think you really brought that out, and people were touched by a lot of things with the ministry. But yet, at the center, you had this highly narcissistic person,
Hmm.
and that's going to be toxic in so many ways.
One of the things I found interesting and wasn't really able to go down the road just because of sort of time and space in the podcast. But if you look at a lot of what Mark taught around this whole idea of like extended adolescence and this idea that
Yeah,
adolescence is a very modern invention. It didn't exist 100 years ago. I always say, like, go read, I can't remember the exact name of it, but Richard Rohr has a book on like the 5 steps of male initiation, right?
uh,
And his whole thing, like Rohr, obviously from a very different place, is looking at manhood in our culture
uh,
and saying men don't have a clear sense of transition from being a boy into being a man.
uh,
And historically, almost every culture in world history did, and they marked it in a significant way, and they honored it, and they made it a meaningful transition. And so in a way, like you look at some of these moments with Mark, whether it was that Saturday morning at the Paradox, or
mhm.
for some folks, maybe that sermon where he's screaming, how dare you, who do you think you are, or whatever. They end up being these kind of milestones in
Yeah,
people's lives. And I talked to people about that Saturday morning in particular where they got the rocks and they went home, and some of these guys were like, yeah, I mean, very disillusioned with the church, very, very disillusioned with Mark, but they're like, but I've still got the rocks. I mean, it meant
uh,
something to me. It was a line
yeah,
in the sand for me. So,
yeah.
Yeah, and that's part of what's so fascinating about the story is these things are just never clean. They're never,
Yeah.
they're never black and white when you're in the midst of them because there's so much community going on
Yeah.
because you didn't experience it alone. Like, yeah, you've got this guy, you might have wounds, but then there were like 10 people around you and those relationships mattered and still matter. And that's as much the source of the hurt is kind of the lost context as anything else.
Hey, friends, I want to invite you to come out to the Theology in the Raw conference next spring, March 31st through April 2nd. It's here in Boise, or you can live stream it. Early bird registration ends on September 30th, okay? So you get a discount if you register before before October 1st. If you're coming out to attend the conference live here in Boise. All the information is on my website, PrestonSpringfield.com. Again, if you are planning on coming out, you definitely want to take advantage of the early bird registration, which is about to end. Okay, I want to talk about the failure porn article. I read it. And I thought it raised some good points. And I love the fact that you even retweeted it, and you were like, this is good. And he wasn't even. This is Liam. Is it Liam Thatcher?
Liam Thatcher. Yeah.
Yeah. And basically, if I could summarize it, you can clarify or jump in or correct. Just that the concern is that the byproduct of this, not the intention. I love that he pointed that out. Like, I don't think this is intended to do this, but there is this failure porn kind of thing going on in a church where we're getting off quite literally, on seeing yet another powerful leader fall. We hate the speaking truth to power and see this is what happened. And it's almost like we almost enjoy it, like kind of like can't stop looking at the car wreck. How have you thought through that, and what are your thoughts on that? Do you think there's some valid concern there? Yeah.
No, I definitely think there's valid concern. Early in the process, I interviewed somebody and who was deeply involved at Mars Hill, and she really surprised me with this comment because she told her story and it was really heartbreaking. And then at the end of the conversation, she says, "Listen, I just want to encourage you on one thing. I want to encourage you to be sure that you try not to focus the story around people who don't love Mark."
Huh.
And that really, really surprised me because it just wasn't a question that had like sort of gotten into my framing yet. And this was maybe a year ago. But her point was this community was such a rich experience for people, and Mark did great harm and Mark did great good. And if we just tell stories from people who are who come in without that context for what was good about the church and what was rich about the church, you miss the story. And I think when I think about the kind of the failure porn line of thinking, I mean, there's a lot of podcasts out right now there's like 2 right now about Jerry Falwell Jr. Gangster Capital has one, and then Wondery has one, and they're produced with excellence. They're well done and all of that. But they're not making those podcasts trying to serve the church, trying to help the church. And this is a 12 episode series. We have a lot of story left to go. There's been a lot of ups and downs and everything. My hope is that for the people who stick with us to the end, we're able to kind of land in a place where people go like, oh, here's a vision for a better and more beautiful church, and if we missed the mark on that, then that's how it's a failure. And that'll be sad for us.
Yeah.
And that's where I think the failure porn critique really comes in. Are we in it because we love the church, or are we in it because we love the car wreck?
And that's something like it's not the intent. Like, if somebody struggles with failure porn, then that's not really on you. I guess somebody could say, well, you're creating something that's going to further that addiction or whatever, but it's like, change the channel. Like, they're responsible to not like a porn, and the analogy does break down because it's like you're not actually creating the porn, that is whatever. But I it sounds like your main motivation, and tell me if I'm on the mark here, is that we can just learn from these mistakes, and even maybe I help people who are in a similar situation, because what's going on there? There's a lot of narcissistic unhealthy Enneagram 8 pastors out there. I don't want to rip on Enneagram.
Right.
And they can be in a church of 50 or 500 or 5,000. Like, it's not just a mega church thing. It's not just a, Mark Driscoll thing. So what is your if you can like summarize your ultimate goal in which you would want people to take away listening to the whole series, what would that be?
Mm-hmm. Well, we're very intentional in the fact that the podcast is called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, and not The Rise and Fall of Mark Driscoll.
Okay.
Because, and again, like, you can't tell the Mars Hill story without telling Mark's story. We talk a lot about Mark, and we will continue to. But what makes this story unique is that, there's a lot of fallen pastors, but not every fallen pastor and not many fallen pastors' stories end in the collapse of the church. And so Mark resigns in the middle of October. January 1st, there is no Mars Hill anymore. And that says a lot. My sense is that a lot of what we see inside Mars Hill is kind of a loud, amplified version of what's going on in a lot of churches. And part of that's due to just the fact that Mark, was sort of unapologetic about what he did and why he did it. And he just said things loudly that would more often be said sort of quietly or behind closed doors, right? So I guess I'm eager for I'm eager for the church to kind of hear this story and understand that bigger dynamic, the collapse of the church, the loss of the context of community, and to ask questions about why we're here, why are we gathered, what are we in it for? For pastors in particular, I mean, yeah, it's funny. I was just with a group of a really large group of pastors last night, some of whom pastors of pretty big churches. And somebody asked me this exact question. And the phrase that came to mind, this will probably make its way into the podcast, was just, I want us all to remember our death, right? We're going to die. What are we going to leave in our wake? And, it was very clear to me that, you look at the Mars Hill story, the church collapsed because Mark resigned. Would the church have been able to sustain Mark getting run over by a bus? Because it was so built around him. And then we need to ask similar questions about our own communities. I think all the time it was like a kind of a catchphrase for us when I was in ministry at the church. There was this old sort of motto for Moravian missionaries. They would say, preach the gospel, die, and be forgotten. Is there a way for that to drive our ministry? And if that was the philosophy of ministry, how much would that change the way we think about media, platform, legacy, all that kind of stuff?
Do you see that as a growing problem in evangelicalism, or is that actually being addressed? The fact that like the church is being built around a personality. Do you think that's increasing or decreasing?
I mean, I think in one sense, I think it's been with the church from the very beginning, right? Like the whole, Paul addressing in the epistles, like, this one says I follow Paul, this one says I follow Apollos, all that kind of stuff. So the desire to attach ourselves to a person is always a temptation. It goes back to the kings, right? Like God tries to make it really clear, like, you don't want a king, you want prophets. I promise, you're not going to like this. And so yeah, I think there's just something innate in us. We want someone who we can look at and kind of identify with. I think what heightens it for us is that, we live in a secular age. People have sort of a simmering spiritual anxiety as a result of that. And so if you show up to church and you're like, I'm not real sure about like the God thing. I'm not real sure if like when I hear people talk about hearing from the Lord or experiencing God, I'm not sure if I can trust my own experience and my own instincts with that. And then a charismatic guy gets up on stage and he goes, well, I've heard from God and God said this, and he has this grand plan for your life. It's way easier in that circumstance to kind of give our agency over. And so I think that's what is sort of unique about our time.
Yeah, I felt that in I was part of Francis Chan's church for a bit, and he's like the counter opposite of a Mark. Like he would tell people, go somewhere else, like leave, like he tried so hard not to make it about himself. He's just but very similarly such a charismatic figure that I could feel it. Like you're just there, and when he's on stage sharing about his faith walk,
Mm-hmm.
it's so easy to live vicariously through him, and feel like you
Mm-hmm.
are part of his spirituality by listening to him. I don't know
Right.
how to get around that. I mean, would he tell the guy
Mm-hmm.
not to speak because he's kind of like the failure report? Like he's doing something really good, but he's also the byproduct can be an unhealthy attachment to a leader.
Mm-hmm.
And he actually did. I mean, that's one
Well,
of the reasons why he kind of said, "I'm done with the megachurch. I'm going
sure.
to do a house church thing."
Sure.
But
Well, I would say, I mean, I think the responsibility in that case, like there's an element of responsibility that Christians need to sort of take on for themselves. Like, I'm not going to project this
Mhm.
on I'm not going to project my spiritual hopes onto another person. I'm going to seek the Lord. I'm going to seek him out in his word and all this. But I think the responsibility on pastors and this is one of the things in the Mars Hill story that I sort of knew was there, but it has surprised me how black and white it is in the story, which is how often Mark makes himself the hero of
Yeah.
the stories he tells, the heroes of his sermons, the hero of the Mars Hill narrative, and then the Mars Hill narrative shifts over the years and people get written out of it. And,
Yeah.
it becomes increasingly over time more and more about him to where, by 2010, there's like a dozen people that you'll never hear their names that were really critical to the story of that church.
Mhm.
So I think the more that pastors and church leaders can think about the narrative they're creating around their ministry and their churches,
Mhm.
and tell it in such a way that they're not the hero, that they're humbled through those events, that they can share these moments of recognition of grace and the need for grace. I think that's really
Yeah.
critical.
Okay. Hey, friends, hope you're enjoying the conversation so far. And if you are enjoying this conversation and others like it, would you consider supporting the Theology in the Raw ministry by going to patreon.com/theology in the raw. You can support the show for as little as $5 a month and get access to lots of different kinds of premium content like monthly Patreon only podcasts and blogs and Q&A sessions. Again, you can go to patreon.com/theology in the raw, or all the info is in the show notes. Okay, I got a few comments here from that Twitter thread, which I did not expect that, because I wasn't even really that aware that this was like a controversial thing. I was expecting to get a bunch of like 5 or 6 responses, like, oh, what was it like putting together a podcast? I think we did have that one, but so anyway, I deleted most of the stupid ones. There's one here I kept. I'm like, should I read this just to I'm like,
man, bring it on. Let's
not.
go for it.
This one was interesting. I went to John MacArthur Seminary in college.
Mm-hmm.
And so this question, why, how come there was no interaction with John MacArthur and his team, who consistently warned about this? Yeah, I got some thoughts, but I would love to hear yours on that.
Sure. Well, again, like, part of what I've been saying kind of all along in this process is that it's a church of 15,000 people, 15 years or 18 years, all these different associations, all these different, relationships, all these different critics and everything. It would just be impossible to sort of give voice to all of them. I think, for one thing, the story's not over yet. We have some elements of the story yet to tell. And we'll get into a couple more of those kind of intersections. But one of the things we're going to talk about actually next week on the podcast is the way negative polarization worked to actually strengthen Mark inside the church. And what I mean by that is that you might be really frustrated with Mark, right? You might be really frustrated. And let's take it out of Mars Hill for a second. You might be really frustrated with your pastor because you've had some bad meetings and you've seen some things go really, really sideways. But if you then open up, open up your email and there's like an email blast, or somebody's started a blog or something, and they're just coming at your church and they're coming at your pastor and all of this, the natural human reaction is to kind of retreat to your tribe and, go, well, this guy might be a jerk, but he's my jerk. So like you can't talk about my jerk that way, and I think there's an interesting dynamic around that. And I would say as well, I think I look at some of it, and frankly, I would include the most recent, the recent episode of the MacArthur podcast where they deal with some of this stuff. I don't know that the polemic around this stuff was constructive. I don't think
Yeah.
it moved the needle in a constructive way for people that weren't convinced in the first place.
And I mean, even though I was in the MacArthur environment when Mark was really taking off, for me, the critiques, as I recall, were more like, he wears biker boots when he preaches and not a suit and tie, and he's charismatic and he
Mm-hmm.
cusses, although maybe we're not sure if that's actually true. Well, no. It was more his edginess. It was like, and I think also for some conservative circles, when somebody is actually like reformed theologically, or they're actually pretty conservative theologically, but they're doing things that feel more progressive, that conservatives don't know how to handle that typically. It's kind of like, no, this is how you do conservative evangelicalism, not that, So I don't personally remember the critique of, this guy's kind of narcissistic and demeaning towards women. I never heard a MacArthur follower say, yeah, I think he's a little too harsh on women, or, like.
Well, there was a really, MacArthur definitely deserves credit when the Song of Solomon sermon first kind of came out. MacArthur wrote a blog post and just eviscerated it, and well done. Like it needed to be done. And again, like it's, we did say in that episode, I mean, Colin Hansen talked about it, like MacArthur was right about Mark in ways that a lot of other people got wrong. And so that's the other thing about this that always kind of gets me. I'm like, I think at least 3 episodes now we've acknowledged MacArthur was right, and I don't know what else to do except to go like, yeah, MacArthur was right. Like we see it, like, but I do think, I mean, again, like what interests me about the story is not necessarily how much was the commentary there, because there was a ton of it. What interests me is what moved the needle, and which way did it move the needle, and was there constructive criticism that actually moved the needle and changed things, and where wasn't there? Yeah. And I'm just not sure that the pyromaniacs and kind of all that effort that went into that, all that heat in the rhetoric, really moved the needle at all.
Yeah. Here's another one, and this one, it's public. It's on Twitter, and I know nothing about this. Since it's public, I no problem reading it. But if you're like, dude, I don't want to get into that, that's totally fine. Because 2 people said, I'm friends with a former Sojourn elder who claims that Sojourn, the church used to pastor, began to exhibit similar leadership problems to Mars Hill. Would love to hear your thoughts on this matter. And somebody else says, I used to work at Sojourn, and yes, this is an issue. So do you want to speak into that at all? Or
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I spoke to it some on the first episode, but yeah, I mean, we were there's a lot in ministry you look back on and go, man, I wish there were some things I could take back, some things I said, some things I wish I could do differently over the years. And when I left, in the years since I left ministry in local church ministry in 2015, I've tried to sort of go back and look for, like, are there things I would do different? Are there people that maybe have residual wounds that I need to try to make things right with? And hey, if any of y'all are listening, like, email me. My DMs are open. I want to hear from you. I want to have those conversations. But what I think a lot of that refers to is, we had the main reason I left the ministry was that probably starting around 2010, our leadership culture got really toxic. We had kind of a revolving door around our executive team, and revolving door around around our lead pastor in particular, and it created a lot of conflict. I mean, it was just a very again, by 2015, it was a very hard place to work, and I had worked really hard to try and sort of try to make it as healthy as I could, and left. And then in 2017, that pastor was put on leave and ultimately resigned as a result of that. So,
is this somebody said a decade-long enablement of Daniel Montgomery abuse? Is that what, I would never.
Sure. Yeah. No, Daniel was the lead pastor at the time. And look, I haven't named him. I'm not, flaming him on, social media or anything like that. That's not what the podcast is about. It's not my story. It's not, it's about this church. But I mean, that was the story. And, and he was, when charges were brought against him by an elder, he was investigated. He was put on leave. He was asked to go through a reconciliation process, and at the end of that, he resigned. So
Okay.
yeah, I don't, it's
Yeah.
I can get more in the weeds to it, but I just don't know how constructive it is to really get into the weeds. But
I think the concern there is like, or the possible accusation. They're not quite saying this, but it's kind of like, hey, you were complicit too in something. But it sounds like the exact opposite, that you saw maybe subtler signs of similar things and said, I this is not what I want to be a part of. I don't have.
Well, I don't want to be. Let me just be clear. Like, I don't want to be too dismissive of that. I mean, I think there are, when you're in that culture, and this is something that you see in Mars Hill, when you're in a culture where there's unhealth and there's unhealthy leaders, you're constantly doing a calculus, and we're trying to highlight this in the story. You're constantly doing a calculus, going, here are the ways the ministry's thriving, here are the problems. Do I think by my efforts I can help right the ship and move things in a good direction? And what one person I interviewed for Mars Hill said this, a few months back, and it just stuck with me because this was my experience. You often walked through ministry going, man, I feel like I'm one good conversation away from being able to get our leadership into a really healthy place, a really healthy culture. And, and then one day you wake up and go, I felt like I was one conversation away for 4 or 5 years now. Like maybe, maybe I'm fooling myself at this point. And that's when you make the transition.
Right. I also wonder too, I mean, I know, so kind of related to the failure porn, like people really, there is almost an enjoyment to see celebrity sneakers and preachers, church leaders who kind of come off as narcissistic, to see them fall. It's like, yes, but I don't know if the church has the corner market on unhealthy leadership and the abuse of power. Hashtag me too. Hashtag look at the world around us everywhere. It's like, and that's not,
well, and that's, well, and that's what, that's where some of the conversation around this that I think gets kind of sidetracked in the theological argument is missing the point. Again, it's not to say there isn't bad theology that causes problems. I totally believe there is. And I believe it's an issue the church is dealing with and needs to deal with. But, the answer isn't like, okay, well, we just need to all become sort of modern, embrace sort of modern, self-expressionism, and that's going to make everything okay. Is there anyone who embodied that more than oh gosh, what's his name? The Hollywood producer. As lefty as anybody could be.
Harvey.
Harvey Weinstein. Just a hardcore leftist activist who was an absolute monster. An absolute monster. So again, I think when we lose sight of the fact that often these abuses are more about power than they are about ideology. We set ourselves up for failure because we think, well, it's not going to happen to me because I believe the right things.
Right. No, that's good. That's good. Here's another one. I really just want to hear a response to the criticism from Mars Hill victims and his deleted statement about people who have spoken out are, quote, punching down on evangelical subculture. I don't even know what that means. Do you know what that means? Or?
Yes, I know exactly what this story is. Okay, so a couple things. I can tell this. Man, you're going right for the tweets.
I'm just quoting what people have said.
You're good, man. You're good. No, I'm happy to actually give an explanation for this. So April 12th, the New York Times did a story about Abraham Piper. They did a profile of him. This is John Piper's son. He's like a TikTok star, and he gets on TikTok every day. And he basically gets on TikTok every day and like throws elbows at the evangelical subculture and that he grew up with, right? And they're funny, they're clever. He's a really funny guy, like all credit due and all that. But it also kind of reads like, if you know the background, it also kind of reads like, dude, this guy got 3 million followers going online and making fun of his dad every day. This was 6 weeks after my dad died. That's part of the background in this. So I saw that. It irritated me. It definitely got under my skin. And I also just saw it as like, in the context of so much of this conversation around deconstruction, you're always sort of hearing these words like, you just need to evolve, you just need to move beyond these kind of primitive things. So when I saw that story and I read it, and it was a good piece of journalism by Ruth Graham. It was well written and all of that. But when I saw it, I just kind of thought, man, like I don't understand why we would look at this as an evolution, right? And so to me, it is punching down. Like cultural power works all kinds of ways. People want to say evangelicals have all the cultural power. Well, it depends on where you stand, right? Like if you're inside evangelicalism, if you're inside conservative circles, evangelicals hold a lot of power. If you're in Hollywood, if you're in the academy, if you're in various aspects of the marketplace, evangelicals have no power and influence whatsoever. Yeah. So power's always relative. Power's always like, where are you trying to leverage power? And if you're trying to leverage power and influence in the media, you're way more likely to be able to do it being a progressive Christian going on there, or a progressive ex-Christian going on there and making fun of your very, very conservative, famous dad. So that was what the whole thing was about. I said nothing about abuse victims, absolutely nothing about abuse victims. That's been pulled out of context and thrown around. And, there's some critics of the podcast that are like, yeah, Mike was making fun of abuse victims or whatever. Go read the tweet. I mean, they've posted it so many times. It's out there. And then, the whole deleted tweets thing. I delete all my tweets.
Really?
There's this phenomenon there's this thing called context collapse that people have written about that, like, this is a perfect example of it. So if you'd read that tweet on April 12th and known that story had dropped that day, because it was a New York Times like trending story and it was going all over Twitter, it would have been obvious what I was subtweeting. Lesson is never subtweet, but it would have been obvious to most people that I was subtweeting. But obviously, like now, however many months later, somebody comes across that and there's no context for it anymore. Yeah. So what I'm talking about, it becomes easy to pull it out and go, oh, this jerk, like, why is he making fun of victims? There's nothing in there about victims. I was tweeting about one person, and I was irritated because it just struck me as distasteful to build a platform making fun of your father.
I think this might be the first time somebody was misunderstood and misrepresented on Twitter. Usually, I think it's a brilliant forum for charitable communication. So it's really shocking to hear. Wow, that's
I think so.
For a tailspin.
Yeah.
Oh, here's another one.
If you go look at my Twitter feed, they all delete at like 60 days. I don't have anything on there older than 60 days because
that's that's a setting you could put on there.
Mm-hmm. You have to like set up a thing like it. You have to do like a one-time delete. But I read an article I think it was in Inc. or something, like quite a while back, where they were basically saying, go delete all your tweets right now. And I was like, oh, that's interesting, because I'm a Twitter junkie. And I was until the podcast. I don't post anymore now that the podcast is out.
Dude, I've really, I do go on Twitter and post sometimes. Typically, I go through Hootsuite where I can post something and it posts and I don't have to sit there and look at, I rarely read and almost never respond to comments. It's just not, I made a policy like 2 or 3 years ago. I don't know if people know that. People out there listening, like sometimes you ask me a question on Twitter and I'll see, I don't, they might say, hey, thanks for your book. And I'll say, hey, thanks for reading or something like that. But in terms of like engaging and constructive when there's like disagreeing kind of issues, it's 99% of the time not productive. So I just stop, Yeah. Hello, friends. I wanted to let you know about an opportunity to engage the conversation about faith, sexuality, and gender on October 20th through 21st here in Boise, Idaho. We're going to be having a conference on faith, sexuality, and gender. On the evening of the 20th, we're going to have a 2.5-hour introduction for those of you who just need to get your arms around the topic. And the next day, October 21st, we're going to have an all-day conference where we're going to dig into a lot of aspects of this really important conversation. You can join us live here in Boise, or you can stream it online. And I would highly encourage you to come out if you can make it, but I know that can be expensive or just not possible. So please consider joining us at least through the live stream option on October 20th or October 21st. All the info is on the website centerforfaith.com /events. That's centerforfaith.com /events.
Yeah.
Well, here's one that I remember seeing. I don't have it written down here, but I thought it was interesting. I don't know what I personally think about it, but it was kind of a cornering question, something like, "How do you?" Wait, do you know what I'm going to say? It was something like, "How do you explain the fact that Christianity Today, who you work for, was complicit in creating this celebrity culture surrounding Mark Driscoll or something like that. Have you come across that kind of criticism? And
yeah, I mean, it's an interesting criticism. I think, you know, my only pushback to it would be, I mean, for one thing, like one of the ways Christianity Today is trying to account for the way that they contributed to the celebrity culture is they've created a podcast in which they're revisiting the entire story and how it happened, and invested in trying to go, why do these things happen? And so there's actually a pretty significant investment by CT trying to answer that exact question.
Yeah.
And we've acknowledged it. I mean, it was part of the, I want to say it was the second or third episode where Colin Hansen, who wrote that profile, came on the show and talked about writing the profile and why, and things he would have done differently, in hindsight. So, we've attempted to kind of address it directly, and I think we're attempting to address it indirectly.
I don't know how you get around that. I mean, Christianity Today is by definition Christian journalism.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to, right? I mean, so to be a journalist, when there's high profile, visible things happening, you address them, talk about them, and you can say, well, it's biased against or biased for, whatever. But that's just also part of journalism, right? I mean, it's
every journalist has a perspective. Well, Ted Olson said something great on the episode that we did about Josh Harris.
Yeah.
He said, I hate the word platforming because it doesn't, like, it implies things that just aren't really true.
Yeah.
Like, just because you talk about someone or talk to someone doesn't necessarily mean you're holding them up and going, hey, we should all do this. Yeah. Right. Part of the job of journalists is to be storytellers and to talk about, like, what is happening right now. And Driscoll was a phenomenon. I mean, Driscoll had a massive influence. He had a massive influence, or I shouldn't say massive. He started having an influence on the North American church a year after he planted in 1996. Wow. That's problematic. I mean, I think that's significantly problematic. Like, why on earth are we taking a guy who did 2 years of sort of residential ministry at a mega church and then is a year into planting another church and putting him in front of church leaders and saying, this is how you get it done, y'all, listen to this 27-year-old. Mm-hmm. But that's a whole other conversation. Like, I just think you're going to run into these things where when you tell news stories, what are we supposed to do? Like, spend a month vetting every story we tell, every profile that we tell? Like, it's just difficult. Yeah. And so what you do is you tell the stories as you see them, and you explore them as honestly and clearly as you can. And then when the facts on the ground change or get clarified in other directions, you try to tell them in other directions. CT published a whole lot of stories starting in 2012 about things that were going wrong at Mars Hill.
Really? Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I have received more criticism in the last year. I mean, I live in criticism, but specifically the platforming thing, and it kind of drives me crazy. Well, not drives me crazy. It's just like I just flat out don't even agree with the concern that underlies this accusation of platforming. Right. Like, I want to engage a wide array of ideas. If I don't, they still exist. I like to do it publicly. You can change the channel if you don't allow. Because I release a podcast on Monday and Thursday. Mm-hmm. I always get messages the following day on each one. Hey, really liked your podcast. I really like your podcast, but I don't think you should have platformed that person. Then the next Thursday, it's something different. Next, so it's like, no matter who it is, there's gonna be somebody that didn't like that person, but they liked everybody else. Well, guess what? The person you like, somebody else didn't like me. And it's like, I think there's something in the air in the last year or 2 years where it's like, I think it's the polarization creating echo chambers and safety. And now there's such a narrow view of if there's an idea I don't agree with, I don't want anybody else to kind of like mention, like, just make it go away. And I just don't think that's healthy at all. I'm not going to have David Duke on the platform, my podcast. I'm just not interested in that conversation. I'm not going to have, I don't know. Who's the opposite of him? Fred Phelps, or, I've got a broad range of different type of. I might have somebody on the podcast I talked to one day, and then have somebody else, and they may completely share opposite views, and it's like
Right.
those views exist. If I think they're interesting and thoughtful, I might completely
Right.
disagree with them, but change the channel. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, do we live in civil society or not? Right.
Yeah.
Because if we do, we ought to be able to talk to our neighbors and try to approach with curiosity. Like, why do you think what you think? Why do you believe the way you believe? How can I be, as a believer, like, how can I be a better neighbor and love you
Right.
better? And part of it is just trying to understand people's stories. So we listen and we ask and all of that. But yeah, I think the negative polarization is a good description for it. I think tribalism is another, good description for it. We just want to hear from people who confirm our biases.
Yeah.
And that gets to an even deeper cultural issue, which is we just don't want to have to think.
Yeah.
We don't want to deal
Yeah.
with people whose ideas make us uncomfortable,
Yeah.
because we just don't want to have to think about them.
Right. Here's a really good question from the Twitter thread, I think. How can we do a better job in America and our churches to build non-toxic leadership? I mean, that is kind of one of the goals, right? That this would serve as a resource to help us avoid another situation like this happening. Do you have ideas on that? I mean, you've been in a church and now living in Mars Hill from a distance for a while now.
Right.
And
Right. Yeah, I would just say, like, what are the metrics for success? I think that becomes a really, really critical issue. Gerardo Marti has been on the podcast a number of times, and there's a clip that I think will show up later. So it's spoiler alert. But one of the things he talks about is, he said, the phenomenon of, like, the church growth movement is that the church's understanding of itself is about momentum. It's about expansion, and it's about rapid expansion. And when that movement and when that expansion stalls or stops, what you end up discovering is that the structure itself is pretty brittle, because you haven't built anything underneath. So when expansion and momentum and growth become the metric by which everything else gets measured, that, for some unique ways, I think we ought to look at, like, what does an approach to ministry that's generational look like? What would a traditioning process look like for leaders? Denominations came to exist for a reason, and I'm not saying we all need to, like, abandon non-denominationalism, though there are plenty of people who'd make that argument and probably make it well. But in the absence of them, Mars Hill is a great example of this. I mean, there was research that I saw recently that basically showed that by and large, the only churches in the country that are growing are non-denominational megachurches. What's the traditioning process? What's the mentoring process whereby leaders in those organizations are being prepared for the next thing? Is there a concern for character? Is there a structure for characterological development, along with, like, here's how you get numbers, here's how you excite a crowd? I just don't think we have the metrics to measure it. And so we're measuring what we can, which is, butts and seats.
Going back to kind of that certain personality too, like you take, and I appreciate you wanting to center this not just on Mark, but on Mars Hill as a whole. But I mean, you take a personality like Mark, and what I mean by, like, the personality where doesn't receive criticism well, creates a quote unquote team that kind of bunch of yes men. And if you're not that, you're kind of pushed out. Or if there is conflict, you kind of take your ball and go home. And, that here's what I'm thinking. I don't want to say it because it probably isn't going to come out wrong, but, like, should that person be a pastor, or if that person is called to ministry, how can that kind of personality genuinely build a team? And that episode where that woman said, that was really disturbing. I mean, when she said his secretary, whatever, I think episode 2 or 3, where there was one thing she would suggest, like, maybe Mark should have some older, wiser people around him that would, not be afraid to push back. And she got called up on heresy charges. Like, that's disturbing, but that might be a more dramatic response, but that kind of response on a subtle level, I'm sure, is very common with somebody who, again, a very black and white kind of leader. And if you don't agree with me, you're a problem, and should that person even be a pastor? Should we screen that ahead of time? Or if that kind of personality is called, like, how can we build genuine team around him where he's not going to get away with that, or I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I guess I would say, one of the things I think you see in Mark, like, first of all, I 100% agree with you. The example, that's Karen Schaefer's story, and what happened to Karen, I think, is one of those examples of like something happening big at Mars Hill that happens in a small scale in lots of places.
Yeah.
And we got a ton of emails from people saying, this happened to me. This exact thing happened to me.
At Mars Hill or just other churches?
Other churches all over the country. Wow. All kinds of churches, different traditions, denominations, the whole 9 yards. And so one of the things I think that exists in all of this, like another metric, I guess I would say for a leader that's qualified is, do they have at any point in their history, can we point to an example where they were under someone else's authority and they submitted to that authority, and in submitting to that authority, they did things they didn't want to do, right? It's one thing to submit to an authority that you agree with. It's a totally different thing to submit to authorities you don't agree with. And, the military trains you in that. A lot of ministry processes train you in that. A lot of educational processes train you in that. But it's not hard in ministry, if you're sort of charismatic and successful, to sort of, find these paths to leadership where that's never tested. And so then when you end up in a place like Mark did, where the accountability structures are pretty flat, and there's not really people, with any authority over him, even the suggestion of it put him in a place where he was pretty reactive.
What was the most, if I can say, that story was pretty disturbing. Do you have one that stands out that you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this happened?
Oh man. Well, the podcast ain't over yet, so there's more to come. But no, again, I don't even necessarily want to focus on that. Yeah. Like, I don't mean to sound dismissive. I mean,
it's kind of a gossipy question. I don't. Yeah. And I don't mean it that was my intention. It's just. Yeah. Anyway. Yeah. Here's my motivation is I think as I hear these stories, it could very easily become gossipy or failure porn or rip. On a positive level, though, it could also be very healing, I think, for other people that say, oh my gosh, that happened to me and I'm not alone. Or you gave voice to something I went through, or I went through that, didn't tell anybody. I'm so glad that these stories are being told as a source of almost healing for people who have been through kind of just spiritual abuse. And I can imagine that story. I mean, being brought up on heresy charges because she said something that was 100% accurate in a really gracious way. Like, that's just... That can destroy someone's faith if they go. I mean, I'm glad it didn't for her, but I think we do need to tell those stories.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, I guess I would say the thing that I find like most disturbing in the story, and again, not just about the Mars Hill guys, but it's something you see reflected in a lot of churches and church leadership culture, including what I came out of. Is that things happen behind closed doors, and people go, that's not right, but I'm going to just keep going because I know that what happens next Sunday is more important. And you make that calculus, every time you make that calculus, it gets easier to do it the next time.
Do you think even our church structure, like our ecclesiology, very Sunday, very growth oriented, very Sunday centric, very much kind of preaching focused, and all these things are good things. But those can very easily, especially in American celebrity culture as a whole, create. It's almost like we're paving the way for, especially if somebody struggles with narcissism or something or whatever, or power abuse, to where it's almost like we're setting them up for failure. This is where some of the more liturgical churches or Eastern churches just don't have. They have other issues, I'm sure, but they don't have this kind of problem. They're just not set up that way.
Right.
I don't know.
Well, I guess I'd say, like, when it comes to the abuse piece, right? Like, that always comes back to power. And so you can look at the Catholic Church and it's like, It almost doesn't matter who your priest is. They're going to rotate different priests out all the time. You're there for the sacrament, and that's why you keep showing up. But power has a way of expressing itself, and it has a way of doing a whole lot of damage in a structure like that. The thing about sort of the evangelical world is because people aren't showing up for the sacrament, and because I think we have often demeaned not just the sacrament, but like the worship, even the experience of community. And what we've done is we've elevated the pulpit to this place where it's like the sermon is the thing. Again, I think that sets people up to go, well, the guy with the Bible, that's the most important thing. That's the reason that I'm here. I once heard Jamie Smith talking about this, and he said, evangelicals wonder why they have a celebrity pastor problem. And then you go to almost any evangelical church and it's 20 minutes of music to get you hyped up for a 45-minute lecture from the smartest guy in the room. That's the model for a lot of churches. And so there's something formative about that, that sort of week in, week out, year in, year out. That's what we experience when we gather at the church. I'd love to see an embrace of more liturgical practice. I'd love to see the church saying, we're not just here for the sermon. We're here to hear the scriptures read, to pray together, to have a broad practice that's really about us as a community sharing an experience together, more than, putting one guy up there and letting him talk for an hour.
And I don't think it's sustainable in a post-internet, post-9/11, post-Trump-ish the world we live in now. Like, I just think that, and we've seen it through COVID, right? I mean, a lot of people aren't coming back to church because they're like, my life kind of went on, and I this whole church experience, this church routine that I didn't have for a year, I don't know if I need that back. I can get a sermon elsewhere. I can listen to Christian music. I think this sense of belonging, which I think deep down is really the deepest need for people. I think they know it. They feel it. I think COVID, they feel it even more. And I feel like if churches can't cultivate that as kind of the centerpiece, almost like the table is the centerpiece of what the rhythm of what we do, everything else is kind of fostering that sense of belonging. I think churches, whether the big or small, obviously bigger churches will probably have more hurdles to hop over. But if we don't cultivate that, I think more than ever we need that, But yeah.
Yeah. I just think charismatic leaders, whether they're worship leaders or, because that's a whole nother dynamic that you could get into of kind of the celebrity culture around worship leaders.
Yeah.
But I think we have a way of sort of attaching to them so that we get vicarious religious experience through them. And it satisfies something in us that, it's a deep need. There's a wound there, I think, that modernity has done to us. And, I love air conditioning. I love antibiotics. Like, thank God for modernity in that sense. But it's not the answer to everything. And it's left some big open questions for us. And I think they're reflected in some of the ways that the church is trying to sort of twist itself into knots to compensate for it.
Well, Mike, thanks so much for your work on the podcast. It really is. I mean, it's so well done. How many hours a week is this like a full-time thing? I mean, I bet.
I don't want to talk about the hours. It's
been
a summer.
That was one of the questions, but we'll let you go. Thanks so much for your honesty and humility. And I'm looking forward to the next few episodes, man.
Thanks.
Well, I guess I'm not supposed to say that. I'm not looking for.
Right. I'm deeply curious and intrigued about the next few episodes.
Yeah. Can you give us an overview of where you're going for the rest of the time, or is that would you rather not?
I guess I'll just say, like, a lot of what we've done here in the middle has been about sort of exploring different thematic issues in the church that kind of span the history. And then we'll sort of pick up the chronology in the last few years in these last few episodes. So
okay, cool.
That's where we're going from here.
Awesome. All right, man. Thanks for coming on the podcast. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.